The truth is that a lot of crime in America is done by, yes, a relatively small group of people, but also a relatively small group of people who have just been like running that for their entire lives. And I'm not referring to like black people overall. I'm talking about a much smaller subset of the population, which admittedly, yes, is also overwhelmingly black. But even the 1350 figure, which refers to like black homicides, that can be further broken down to really emphasize like the huge glaring problem here. So most of the black people that are going around murdering are men. So that can then be further reduced to about 6.5%, 7% from the 13. And then of those 7%, mostly it's the youths doing the murders. So you can further reduce that percentage down. And then from there, it's like undoubtedly a relatively smaller, exceptionally violent subset of the population, which is committing the bulk of these murders. I haven't found any solid data on the 290 thing, but it's clear Trump is getting at something very real, even if like the actual numbers are a little off. I'm sure the fact checkers are out in all force saying, well, actually, 2% of the population are only doing 89% of the crime, as if that is not like basically correct, what Trump is saying, as if he's not directionally correct, as if them adding the actually is going to make, the sort of vector he's casting untrue itself. That's not obviously the case, but that's how they operate. We're sort of used to that by now. But what's fascinating is that liberals, these kinds of they really worship like empiricism, right? They use studies and sources like their Pokemon cards. They have no ability to evaluate the information in their own head, make arguments, by themselves extemporaneously. They simply like read the title of the study or the article, recognize it as something that is generally in support of their worldview, and then they throw it down in front of you like they're playing a Charizard. And now you're not fighting with them. They can't elaborate on any of this. They have no idea what they're talking about. You now have to fight the piece of paper. And then if you beat the piece of paper, they will simply pull out another piece of paper. That's why you have to give yourself permission to recognize that these people are not real. It is not worth your time to interact with them in a meaningful sense. You basically just have to do whatever you can to suppress their influence throughout society. You literally could be reading data from an FBI chart. It doesn't matter. But they always have a big problem with this stuff. The ADL famously created a web page to warn of the dangers of the 1350 meme. They refer to the 50% figure as like alleged, suggesting that it's not actually true. It's not actually the case that like black people in America are responsible for half of the homicides. And it read the number 13 in conjunction with either the number 52 or the number 90 is a shorthand reference to racist propaganda by white people. And they're claiming that African Americans are like these savages and these criminals and blah, blah, blah. So the implication here is kind of funny. Like it seems to me that the ADL is basically saying that if the 1350 meme is true, well, then black people are basically just like savage criminals, and which is, of course, not the position that we're taking. We are taking a position of law and order. It's not like a bigoted position. It's simply wanting law and order. But the ADL, of course, has to make this into this sort of very taboo, evil thing to compel people to not buy into what is obviously true and right in front of them. It's saying, hey, you can do that. You can align yourselves with reality, but there's going to be a social cost. And unfortunately, that is going to compel most people to simply go with the safer option. That's going to cause a little bit less friction, right? But despite the ADL's attempts to confuse people, lazily implying, but even if they don't outright claim that the 1350 figure is unfounded, the truth is that, black people obviously do commit roughly half of all homicides in America. The exact figure changes from year to year. According to the FBI in 2019, it was like 51.3% of all homicides. By 2020, I think it was getting closer to 56. The point being, you have to wonder why the Anti-Defamation League didn't bother verifying this. I mean, they're sitting on a boatload of cash. Like, you're seriously telling me they couldn't just like pay someone to verify whether the 1350 thing were even true? Of course they could, but they don't want to. The ADL, like all libtard organizations, is not interested in truth. They are interested in propagating liberalism, policing people's navigation of reality. And personally, I do find that incredibly revealing that in order to do so, they can't actually tell the truth, which is kind of hilarious. But of course, that's the nature of leftism, right? It's founded on lies. As the old cliche goes, the truth does not fear investigation. If you've got nothing to hide, what's the problem with us giving you a little frisk? It does not fear investigation. So if your worldview necessitates the denial of like basic statistical realities, then it's obviously not a worldview worth adhering to. And homicide isn't the only form of crime in which blacks are overrepresented. Like according to the same FBI data, blacks are committing like 27% of all rapes, 53% of all robberies, 33% of all aggravated assaults, like 30% of burglaries, 42% of weapons charges, 42% of prostitution charges. In fact, if you actually account for their population size, there is not a single crime category in which they are not overrepresented. And in fact, just in the total like aggregate, I believe it's true that the only crimes which they are not committing like the most of per capita are like drunk driving, which is Hispanics, and I believe also child molestation, which is also Hispanics. But it's crazy though. Sometimes when you bring up that figure, liberals will say, well, most crime is intraracial, meaning, it doesn't really matter. The perpetrators and the victim are both of the same race. And yeah, that's true. Like when we're talking about black people committing, half of all homicides, most of this is black on black crime, which the media doesn't really talk about. Democrats don't really talk about because they would rather have there be like a white person involved for them to villainize. But most of this black on black crime is like black teenagers like talking trash on Facebook, driving by they ops house and just like shooting everybody in sight. I remember watching a video on YouTube once in which a white guy went into the hood. Remember that whole genre of content, doing XYZ in the hood? There's a lot of great anthropology taking place on YouTube. You can learn a lot on YouTube about different people, different cultures, more so than you can perhaps learn when pursuing a major in anthropology at almost any major, academic institution. But yeah, they would go into the hood and they would interview like, older black people about how things have changed over the years, get the OG perspective, the UNC perspective. And one of these black guys said something that really, really stuck with me, as they often do. He said that back in the day, most of the crime occurred, even the violent crime, and it would have to do with something like drugs and other kind of like money-making endeavors. Like people were out there hustling. They were getting a bag. That was the focus. And this same old head said that it was the younger guys in the hood that were just like shooting each other over trivial stuff, like, social media beefs, dissing, that kind of stuff. And if you spend any time on Twitter, like you probably wouldn't be surprised by that. Like things can get pretty nasty on right-wing Twitter. People love to do this kind of stuff: character assassination, doxing, blackmailing, whispering campaigns, coordinated takedowns, all this kind of stuff, right? It's a very sort of dysfunctional group of people. It's a vicious place, right? Now imagine if we were all like, poor black 16-year-olds and we all probably had like, below average education and intelligence and all. We would probably all just be shooting each other all day, right? Like that's just sort of like what would probably go on in that situation. But fortunately, we are not in that position, and so we can continue waging war on the trenches of the timeline on Twitter. But this is just sort of like the reality of that situation, right? So it is true that most crime is intraracial, but when it comes to interracial crime, which is, again, always the focus because they want to find a white person to vilify, even then, black people are overwhelmingly the offenders. And it's harder to find data here, but we do have information that says it's something like 25 times. Like black people are 27 times more likely to attack a white person than vice versa. And when this happens, they call it, the knockout game. Remember that when there was that trend like 10, 15 years ago? Black people just running around like sucker punching white people and knocking them unconscious. And then the media had to respond to this by saying, oh, it's just like a game. It's just like something, it's just a silly little game. Didn't you ever ding dong ditch? You ever egg a house? That's like kind of what's going on. Yeah, that guy that just died because his head like landed the wrong way on the cement? You're telling me you've never ding dong ditched? Like that is literally how the media was treating this kind of thing. But that's like the reality of it, right? Like you've got this kind of just dysfunctional antisocial conduct, and it tends to persist throughout lifetimes. That's why you have these repeat offenders, right? And you can often see this like, after a particularly vicious incident of black crime. Great example recently, we all remember from last fall. You had the murder of Irina Zarutska. She's a 23-year-old Ukrainian refugee. This was, of course, the talk of the town, rightfully so, right? She was on a train in August, I believe. Yeah, August 2025. She was on her way home from working at the pizzeria. And she was engrossed in her phone, and then this black guy, DeCarlos Brown, just slashes her throat open with a knife. And of course, yeah, she died like immediately. Just like this beautiful young girl on her way home from the pizza parlor. And yeah, she just gets killed. And it's just like one of those things. Every day in America, you're like, it's a dice roll. It's like an RGN, right? As to whether or not you're going to encounter some kind of situation that just like kills you randomly because we refuse to enforce basic standards of civilization. And as it would turn out, this DeCarlos character was one of these repeat offenders. He had a lengthy rap sheet. He had convictions for armed robbery, larceny, breaking into... But thanks to these like, Soros-installed, libtard-installed DAs, prosecutors, judges, he was out on the street, free to kill whomever he pleased, which just so happened to be like a 23-year-old white girl. Like this is something you see play out over and over again. It's a tragedy. There is a tragic black on white murder rate in this country, which nobody talks about, but we still have to talk about Emmett Till 70 years later. Remember Cannon Hinnon? Remember that little girl in the parking lot of a grocery store like 2 years ago who got stabbed by this black woman who was just having a bad day? Of course you don't. Nobody talks about this anymore. No one will ever talk about this woman ever again, except for us. Meanwhile, your kids are going to have to know Emmett Till's name 70 years later. Give me a break. You're telling me that hasn't happened again in 70 years? They got that one time. This happens like literally 10 times a month in this country. Nobody talks about it. Nobody does anything about it. We're all just sort of, we have to go along with it because remember that one time we did something bad, which literally was not even our fault in reference to the plight of the African American in this country. Give me a break, dude. And then, too, you find out the perpetrator has spent his entire life doing the most evil stuff imaginable, only to be given slaps on the wrist. What am I supposed to do in this situation? What is my next best move in this situation? How am I supposed to have faith in any of the institutions which I've been led to believe hold society together? Like, we should not have to live this way. Well-to-do people should not be forced to deal with insane, violent freaks as they're going about their day-to-day. Which is why, again, as we've talked about, the Trump administration's to deal with crime in general in these kinds of city environments has been spectacular. But that is what leftism is at the end of the day, right? You are reorienting society to accommodate the worst of the worst. That is what equality is. That is what cultural Marxism is. When your civilization starts siding with criminals over law-abiding citizens, yeah, you kind of have an idea that you're on the path to ruin at that point. But left-wing racial ideology in America demands that black people be treated as these hapless, innocent victims who can do no wrong. And even if they do something wrong, it's not even really their fault. It's only because something bad happened to them, which compelled them to do that. Okay, I don't know, man. I know a lot of stories of like bad stuff happening to a lot of people and they don't end up, going and getting armed robbery convictions, stabbing people to death on the train. It's just, I don't know. But again, I'm just a guy asking questions, right?